This week we're going to talk about variegation and texture. People think these are exactly the same thing, but in fact they are not. Texture has to do with the actual physical feeling of the surface of a subject, while variegation is a pattern on the surface. So if you were to take your hand and rub it over the surface of an object, you would know whether it was texture or whether it was variegation. So I have some fruits and vegetables here, and then I'll show you a few photographs of flowers that deal with these two ideas. Basically, they're both textures. One is just a surface texture, and the other is a true texture. So let's talk about true texture first. Let's take this lovely avocado here, and as you can see, you have actual texture. If you were to run your hands across this avocado, you would definitely feel a change in the surface. So what does that mean in terms of painting? Well, it means that not only do you have to think about the highlight for the overall form, which is this kind of egg-shaped form, but you also have to think about highlights that are reflected off of all of these textural surfaces. So that's a little bit more complicated in terms of painting. Now let's take something that is just a variegated form. This is a passion fruit. And if you look at it really closely and you run your hand across the surface of this, there is no surface difference from one side of the form to the other. It feels nice and smooth. In this case, the variegation is within the surface of the specimen, and it means that there's a highlight, but the highlight is not changed by the surface pattern on the fruit itself. So what happens in this case is that when this pattern goes to the darker area of the subject, all the pattern gets darker as well, and you don't see any reflected light coming off of the surface. So this is considered variegated pattern. If we look at a kiwi, however, we are again dealing with a surface that has some sort of textural interest to it. And although you don't get to see reflections for every single one of these little hairs that live on the surface of this kiwi, basically you will be adding them, and depending on where they are on the surface will determine whether they are very light or whether they are dark. But they do, even in the dark area, and I don't know if you, I guess you can see that. In the dark area, you can actually see these little hairs that are on the surface because they do catch the light. It's just a different kind of light than the avocado. This is the subject that I am going to paint for you. And this subject does have a very large texture, which are these large bumps that define the form of this object. So you do have to deal with that shading. But in terms of the pattern or the variegation on these areas, they are smooth. There is no raised surface to each one of these dark shapes. So we are dealing with two things here. We are dealing not only with the structural form that has some, and I think it's a little extreme to call it texture because they're such large forms, but we're definitely dealing with variegation or surface pattern on this object. Now here we have this lovely little tomatillo, and there is definitely a lot of pattern going on, but this is more like a pillowing type of pattern, and yet if I run our finger across it, you can feel the veination on the shell of this tomatillo. So this one also is considered true texture as opposed to variegated texture. And you can tell that you will see shadows depending on the side that the veination occurs in relation to the light. You will see shadows to define that veination. Your assignment sheet will have the step-by-step for how to do this. You'll be able to use the techniques that I talk about for almost every subject that has either texture or variegation. I'm going to show you 3 photographs. This particular orchid was a photo I took at the New York Botanical Garden. And here, this is definitely variegation. There's no raised surface to these patterns on the orchid itself. And because they're part of the form itself, the way that the shadows work, the shadows define the surface blade shape, and then the pattern is superimposed on top of that. The same is true for this flower here. And you can see there's all kinds of pattern. But if you notice, you don't see any change in the shadows and the highlights for each one of these patterns because these, again, are variegated. The last one I want to show you is this lily, which deals with both textural surface and it deals with variegation. So you'll notice, especially noticeable in this one lily leaf here, you can see all of the changes in the surface because the light is reflecting off that surface. You're seeing these pillow shadows that are part of this lily pad. But then you also have, on top of that, you have this surface pattern, and you can see it on almost all of these. Some have more than others. But this surface pattern is really built into the surface of the lily pad and has absolutely nothing to do with the pillowing that is part of the structural aspect of this lily. So this is our last project. You'll have to select a piece that can meet the criteria for this assignment.